left these lands. All the lands of the Dumnumni, and all of Somerset in his grasp, but he wanted more. He vowed to conquer all of Britain. Well, he fought in the east and conquered in the east, but then he rode north, and Britain was longer than he had thought it was. And so winter came, before he looked for it, and he rode back with his troops, back down to his capital, in Iska. Well, it was towards the end of October, and he was camping in a wood in Somerset, where all of a sudden he tired of all his soldiers, and their smelly ways and their yarning, and so he went a little way out of their camp, and there sat by a great tree. And he had sat there, dreaming off to sleep, drinking his wine, eating his bread, with his sword close at hand, when suddenly he heard clippity-clop, 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 coming through the forest. And he looked, and what do you think he saw? A goat in full armour, and sitting on the goat was a little man with a long beard, and in his hand he held a double axe. And the man rode close to him and said, King Helm, here is a king that you will not conquer. So will you be my blood brother or my foe? And as Helm looked around, he suddenly realised the forest was alive with the hunters of his little warriors everywhere. He was suddenly held down, and he saw his camp was in peril, and he could not call out. And the little figure on the goat rose up close and said, I am the king of the dwarfs. Will you be my friend or my foe? And King Helm said, I have no choice. Let us be blood brothers. And the king of the dwarfs took out a cup from his pocket, cut his hand, and Helm cut his, and they bled into the cup, and drank wine and blood together. And then the king of the dwarfs laughed and said, I have a merry jest. When you are married, I shall come to your wedding, and when you are married, I shall come to yours, and when I am married, you may come to mine. And Helm said, but I am not engaged. And the king of the dwarfs said, well, I know many things. Well, now, it was true. Helm was not engaged to be married, but he rode back down to Esker, and there he had a great party for all, Christmas Yuletide party, for all the people he had conquered. From the west, from the east, and in the west they all came, including a certain nobleman's daughter. And Helm looked on her with eyes of approval. Well, they got on well, and before spring was out, they were engaged to be married, and on midsummer their marriage was due. But just on the day before they were married, in the great basilica in Iska that stood there came news that there was a people coming towards them, a people no one had seen, and they all flocked to the walls, and there was a great army of dwarfs, but not arranged for war, but rather with pleasure, with endless tricks and bangers, and toys the like of which no one had ever seen, and crackers, and fireworks, and gold, and silver, and mead. And the party lasted for over a week. And at the end of a week, the king of the dwarfs said, well, I must ride back to my folk, but thank you for the great entertainment, King Helm, but be sure to come to my wedding. And off the king of the dwarfs rode, off up into the moor, and disappeared. For a year or more, no one heard of him, but Helm settled down quite happily, ruling in Iska. But as the year turned on the second year, he had word that the king of the dwarfs was to get married. And so it was, just before All Hallows Eve, he called together the finest troops of his kingdom, all the beer he could muster, fabric from far off Byzantium. And he rode off up into the moor, up by Haytor rocks. But the rocks were not closed as we now know them, but rather open, with a great door. And Helm looked in, and he saw there were candles lighting into a cavern, and he went into the cavern, and the king of the dwarfs, his blood brother, welcomed him as a long lost friend, and the party lasted seemed to Helm but a week. But at the end of the week he turned to the king of the dwarfs and said, now it is my time to go. And the king of the dwarfs said, must you go? It might not be so simple. The lands might have changed much since you rode away. And Helm said, no, I will go. You went home, I will go home. And the king of the dwarfs, when he could not dissuade him, said, well, take this bloodhound, and be sure, do not get off your horse until the bloodhound howls 3 times. And Helm wondered what he meant, and rode off with his host down the slopes of Dartmoor, back to his capital, Iska. But Iska was gone. There was only a low parapet and the ruins of a city, and in the centre of the ruins was an old, old hut. And King Helm went up to the hut and called out, "Is there anyone there?" An old woman came out and said, "Who be you be?" And he said, I am your king, King Helm, but where is my capital Liska?" And the woman said, "Oh, King Helm? Oh, I remember. It was a story told by my grandfather's grandfather of how there had been once a king in here, king of the Dumnumni, but how he had ridden off up into the moor one day with all of the men of Devon, and then his queen had been left to try and hold the kingdom and hadn't hold it, and then the Saxon came, and now Alfred is our king." And King Helm said, "What?" But one of his chief retainers said, "This is nonsense. I'll show her. I'll spank her into peace and plenty. We'll get back to our lands." And he jumped off his horse. And all of a sudden, he was no more. There was just bone where he had been. And Helm looked at the bloodhound, and the bloodhound did not howl. And Helm rode off into the night, and you can still hear him in the storms of October at his head, riding through Devon, waiting for the bloodhound to howl. But the hound will not howl until the end of days, when Helm comes once back more to Devon to set all to rights. That was a traditional story, the story of King Helm.
Absolutely. So now this.